Hello, this is Morale Bernard with the continuation of the story, Affairs at Styles, with Hercule Poirot. Last words were, there is a woman with a head and a heart too, Hastings, though the good God gave her no beauty. And as I proceed, please, by the way, please subscribe to the channel and please share the video. Thank you very much. So let me continue. I followed John's example and went out into the hall, where Miss Howard was endeavouring to extricate herself from the voluminous mass of veils that enveloped her head. As her eyes fell on me, a sudden pang of guilt shot through me. This was the woman who had warned me so earnestly, and to whose warning I had alas paid no heed. How soon, and how contemptuously, I had dismissed it from my mind. Now that she had just been proven justified in so tragic a manner, I felt ashamed. She had known Alfred Inglethorpe only too well. I wondered whether, if she had remained at Styles, the tragedy would have taken place, or would the man have feared her watchful eyes. I was relieved when she shook me by the hand with her well-remembered painful grip. The eyes that met mine were sad, but not reproachful. That she had been crying bitterly. I could tell by the redness of her eyelids, but her manner was on change from its old gruffiness. Started the moment I got the wire. Just come off night duty. Hired car. Quickest way to get here. Have you had anything to eat this morning, Evie? Asked John. No. I thought not. Come along. Breakfast's not cleared away yet, and they'll make you some fresh tea. He turned to me. Look after her, Hastings, will you? Wells is waiting for me. Oh, here's Monsieur Poirot. He's helping us, you know, Evie. Miss Howard shook hands with Poirot, but glanced suspiciously over her shoulder at John. What do you mean, helping us? Helping us to investigate. Nothing to investigate. Have they taken him to prison yet? Taken who to prison? Who? Alfred Inglethorpe, of course. My dear Evie, do be careful. Lawrence is of the opinion that my mother died from heart seizure. More fool Lawrence, retorted Miss Howard. Of course Alfred Inglethorpe murdered poor Emily, as I always told you he would. My dear Evie, don't shout so. Whatever we may think or suspect, it is better to say as little as possible for the present. The inquest isn't until Friday. Not until fiddlesticks? The snort Miss Howard gave was truly magnificent. You're all off your heads. The man will be out of the country by then. If he's any sense, he won't stay here tamely and wait to be hanged. John Cavendish looked at her helplessly. I know what it is, she accused him. You've been listening to the doctors. Never should. What do they know? Nothing at all, or just enough to make them dangerous. I ought to know. My own father was a doctor. That little Wilkins is about the greatest fool that even I have ever seen. Heart seizure. Sort of thing, you would say. Anyone with any sense could see at once that her husband had poisoned her. I always said he'd murder her in her bed, poor soul. Now he's done it, and all you can do is to murmur silly things about a heart seizure and inquest on Friday. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, John Cavendish. What do you want me to do? Asked John, unable to help a faint smile. Dash it all, Evie, I can't haul him down to the local police station by the scruff of his neck. Well, you might do something. Find out how he did it. He's a crafty beggar. Dare say he soaked fly papers. Ask cook if she missed any. It occurred to me, very forcibly, at that moment, that to harbour Miss Howard and Alfred Inglethorpe under the same roof, and keep the peace between them, was likely to prove a Herculean task, and I did not envy John. I could see by the expression of his face that he fully appreciated the difficulty of the position. For the moment, he sought refuge in retreat, and left the room precipitately. Dorcas brought in fresh tea. As she left the room, Poirot came over from the window where he had been standing and sat down facing Miss Howard. "Mademoiselle," he said gravely, "I want to ask you something." "Ask away," said the lady, eyeing him with some disfavour. "I want to be able to count upon your help." "I'll help you to hang Alfred with pleasure," she replied gruffly. "Hanging is too good for him. Ought to be drawn and quartered, like in good old times." "We are at one then," said Poirot, "for I too want to hang the criminal. Alfred Inglethorpe, him or another?" "No question of another. Poor Emily was never murdered until he came along. I don't say she wasn't surrounded by sharks. She was. But it was only her purse they were after. Her life was safe enough. But along comes Mr. Alfred Inglethorpe, and within 2 months, hey, presto!" "Believe me, Miss Howard," said Poirot very earnestly, "if Mr. Inglethorpe is the man, he shall not escape me. On my honour, I will hang him as high as Haman." "That's better," said Miss Howard more enthusiastically. "But I must ask you to trust me. Now, your help may be very valuable to me. I will tell you why. Because in all this house of mourning, yours are the only eyes that have wept." Miss Howard blinked, and a new tone crept into the gruffness of her voice. "If you mean that I was fond of her, yes, I was. You know, Emily was a selfish old woman in a way. She was very generous, but she always wanted a return. She never let people forget what she had done for them, and that way she missed love. Don't think she ever realized it, though, or felt the lack of it. Hope not, anyway. I was on a different footing. I took my stand from the first. So many pounds a year, I'm worth to you. Well and good. But not a penny piece besides, not a pair of gloves, nor a theatre ticket." She didn't understand, was very offended sometimes, said I was foolishly proud. It wasn't that, but I couldn't explain. Anyway, I kept my self-respect, and so, out of the whole bunch, I was the only one who could allow myself to be fond of her. I watched over her. I guarded her from the lot of them, and then a glib-tongued scoundrel comes along and push! All my years of devotion go for nothing. Poirot nodded sympathetically. "I understand, mademoiselle. I understand all you feel. It is most natural. You think that we are lukewarm, that we lack fire and energy. But trust me, it is not so." John stuck his head in at this juncture and invited us both to come up to Mrs. Inglethorpe's room, as he and Mr. Wells had finished looking through the desk in the boudoir. As we went up the stairs, John looked back to the dining room door and lowered his voice confidentially. "Look here. What's going to happen when these two meet? I shook my head helplessly. I've told Mary to keep them apart if she can. Will she be able to do so? The Lord only knows. There's one thing. Inglethorpe himself won't be too keen on meeting her. You've got the keys still, haven't you, Poirot? I asked as we reached the door of the lock room. Taking the keys from Poirot, John unlocked it, and we all passed in. The lawyer went straight to the desk, and John followed him. My mother kept most of her important papers in this dispatch case, I believe, he said. Poirot drew out the small bunch of keys. Permit me. I locked it out of precaution this morning. But it's not locked now. Impossible. See. And John lifted the lid as he spoke. Milius Torneris, cried Poirot, dumbfounded, and I, who have both the keys in my pocket. He flung himself on the case. Suddenly he stiffened. Et voilà, une affaire. This lock has been forced. What? Poirot lay down the case again. But who forced it? Why should they? When? But the door was locked. These exclamations burst from us disjointedly. Poirot answered them categorically, almost mechanically. Who? That is the question. Why? Ah, if I only knew. When? Since I was here an hour ago. As to the door being locked, it is a very ordinary lock. Probably any other of the door keys in this passage would fit it. We stared at one another blankly. Poirot had walked over to the mantelpiece. He was outwardly calm, but I noticed his hands, which from long force of habit were mechanically straightening the spill vases on the mantelpiece, were shaking violently. See here. It was like this, he said at last. There was something in that case. Some piece of evidence, slight in itself perhaps, but still enough of a clue to connect the murderer with the crime. It was vital to him that it should be destroyed before it was discovered, and its significance appreciated. Therefore he took the risk, the great risk, of coming in here. Finding the case locked, he was obliged to force it, thus betraying his presence. For him to take that risk, it must have been something of great importance. But what was it? Ah, cried Poirot, with a gesture of anger, that I do not know. A document of some kind, without doubt, possibly the scrap of paper Dorcas saw in her hand yesterday afternoon, and I. His anger burst forth freely. Miserable animal that I am, I guessed nothing. I have behaved like an imbecile. I should never have left that case here. I should have carried it away with me. Ah, triple pig. And now it is gone. It is destroyed. But is it destroyed? Is there not a chance we must leave no stone unturned? He rushed like a madman from the room, and I followed him as soon as I had sufficiently recovered my wits. But by the time I had reached the top of the stairs, he was out of sight. Mary Cavendish was standing where the staircase branched, staring down into the hall in the direction in which he had disappeared. What has happened to your extraordinary little friend, Mr. Hastings? He has just rushed past me like a mad bull. He's rather upset about something, I remarked feebly. I really did not know how much Poirot would wish me to disclose. As I saw a faint smile gather on Mrs. Cavendish's express mouth, I endeavoured to try and turn the conversation by saying, "They haven't met yet, have they?" "Who?" "Mr. Inglethorpe and Miss Howard." She looked at me in rather a disconcerting manner. "Do you think it would be such a disaster if they did meet?" "Well, don't you?" I said, rather taken aback. "No." She was smiling in her quiet way. "I should like to see a good flare-up. It would clear the air. At present we are all thinking so much and saying so little." "John doesn't think so," I remarked. "He's anxious to keep them apart." "Oh, John." Something in her tone fired me, and I blurted out, "Oh, John's an awfully good sort." He studied me curiously for a minute or two, and then said, to my great surprise, "You are loyal to your friend. I like you for that." "Aren't you my friend too?" "I am a very bad friend." "Why do you say that?" "Because it is true. I'm charming to my friends one day and forget all about them the next." I don't know what impelled me, but I was nettled, and I said foolishly and not in the best of taste, "Yet you seem to be invariably charming to Dr. Bornstein." Instantly, I regretted my words. Her face stiffened. I had the impression of a steel curtain coming down and blotting out the real woman. Without a word, she turned and went swiftly up the stairs, whilst I stood like an idiot gaping after her. I was recalled to other matters by a frightful row going on below. I could hear Poirot shouting and expounding. I was vexed to think that my diplomacy had been in vain. The little man appeared to be taking the whole house into his confidence, a proceeding of which I, for one, doubted the wisdom. Once again I could not help regretting that my friend was so prone to lose his head in moments of excitement. I stepped briskly down the stairs. The sight of me calmed Poirot almost immediately. I drew him aside. "My dear fellow," I said, "is this wise? Surely you don't want the whole house to know of this occurrence. You are actually playing into the criminal's hands." "You think so, Hastings?" "I'm sure of it." Well, well, my friend, I will be guided by you." "Good. Although, unfortunately, it is a little too late now." "Sure." He looked so crestfallen and abashed that I felt quite sorry, though I still thought my rebuke a just and wise one. "Well," he said at last, "let us go, mon ami." "You have finished here?" "For the moment, yes." "You will walk back with me to the village?" "Willingly." He picked up his little suitcase and we went out through the open window in the drawing-room. Cynthia Murdoch was just coming in, and Poirot stood aside to let her pass. "Excuse me, mademoiselle, 1 minute." "Yes." She turned inquiringly. "Did you ever make up Mrs. Inglethorpe's medicines?" A slight flush rose in her face as she answered rather constrainedly, "No." "Only her powders?" The flush deepened as Cynthia replied, "Oh yes, I did make up some sleeping powders for her once." "These?" Poirot produced the empty box which had contained powders. She nodded. "Can you tell me what they were? Sulphona? Veronal?" "No, they were bromide powders." "Ah, Thank you, mademoiselle. Good morning. As we walked briskly away from the house, I glanced at him more than once. I'd often before noticed that if anything excited him, his eyes turned green, like a cat's. They were shining like emeralds now. My friend, he broke out at last, I have a little idea, a very strange and probably utterly impossible idea, and yet it fits in. I shrugged my shoulders. I privately thought that Poirot was rather too much given to these fantastic ideas. In this case, surely, the truth was only too plain and apparent. So that is the explanation of the blank label on the box, I remarked. Very simple, as you said. I really wonder that I did not think of it myself. Poirot did not appear to be listening to me. They have made one more discovery, Labas, he observed, jerking his thumb over his shoulder in the direction of Styles. Mr. Wells told me as we were going upstairs. What was it? Locked up in the desk in the boudoir, they found a will of Mrs. Inglethorpe's, dated before her marriage, leaving her fortune to Alfred Inglethorpe. It must have been made just at the time they were engaged. It came quite as a surprise to Wells and to John Cavendish also. It was written on one of those printed will forms and witnessed by two of the servants, not Dorcas. Did Mr. Inglethorpe know of it? He says not. One might take that with a grain of salt, I remarked sceptically. All these wills are very confusing. Tell me, how did those scribbled words on the envelope help you to discover that a will was made yesterday afternoon? Poirot smiled. Mon ami, have you ever, when writing a letter, been arrested by the fact that you did not know how to spell a certain word? Yes, often, I suppose. Everyone has. Exactly. And have you not, in such a case, tried the word once or twice on the edge of the blotting paper, or a spare scrap of paper, to see if it looked right? Well, that is what Mrs. Inglethorpe did. You will notice that the word possessed is spelt first with one S and subsequently with two correctly. To make sure, she had further tried it in a sentence thus, I am possessed. Now, what did that tell me? It told me that Mrs. Inglethorpe had been writing the word possessed that afternoon, and having the fragment of paper found in the grate fresh in my mind, the possibility of a will, a document almost certain to contain that word, occurred to me at once. This possibility was confirmed by a further circumstance. In the general confusion, the boudoir had not been swept that morning, and near the desk were several traces of brown mould and earth. The weather had been perfectly fine for some days, and no ordinary boots would have left such a heavy deposit. I wonder whose boots? Join me for the next episode of Affairs at Styles. Join me, Morel Bernard, for the next episode of Affairs at Styles. I'll see you then. Bye.